All right, so we're done with this class. Let's go ahead and create the constructor of this class. When someone creates an object of this class, what happens? All right, so the constructor, I'm going to do that here. It's also just like a regular method, but it has no keyword static, okay? And at the same time, it has no return type. It has no return type because we do not explicitly call this method. This method is called when someone tries to create an object from this class. It's automatically called. And so that's why it can't return. We can't set a return type. It can't return data. Okay? And so it just has the keyword. It has the access specified. It's going to be a public, okay, constructor. Of course, that's what code outside of this class is going to use to create an object from this class. Okay, so public and just the name of the constructor. And now the name of the constructor has to be the same as the name of the class, which is called gradebook. Okay, has to be the same as the name of the class. So public gradebook, no keyword static, and then no return type. Apart from that, it looks just like a regular method. Okay, so when someone creates an object from this class, what happens? Now, I wanted us to create this program in such a way that the user enters, or we can modify how many students we're dealing with and how many test scores per student, instead of sticking with what the question says, which is 5 arrays, or basically 5 students, or 4 doubles each, or basically 5 students or 4 scores each. Let's design this program in such a way that it's flexible. And so I'm going to add 2 more fields to this here, which is going to represent, these fields are going to store the number of students and the number of test scores per student. Okay, it's going to be a private field. Okay, it's going to be a constant, a final value, a final entity. So private final number, it's just the number of students, so it's going to be an int. So private final int. Okay, I'm going to call it number of student. Number of students. I'm using this convention with underscores and capital letters just to represent constant. But you can use lowercase if you want. But this is the convention for final values. So number of students, I'm not going to initialize it now. I'm just going to declare the variable. I'm going to do the same thing for number of test scores per student. So private final, well, int number of test scores, okay, per student. Now this is going to be long, but again, if you want to use your own variable names, feel free to do that. I just like naming mine this way just so it makes sense. And so let's see, number of students, number of test scores per student. What did I type? Per long. All right, so let's see. As a matter of fact, we don't have to. Although this is a good idea, we don't have to. Let's go ahead and remove it. The reason why you can do this for clarity, just to have multiple steps and multiple clear independent steps, you can do this, but we don't have to, and I'll explain why. All right, we can directly use the values that the user gives us once they create an object from this class. So even though it was a good idea, let's just scratch it for now. But you can still stick with it if it makes it clear for you. So when someone creates an object from this class, they have to provide us how many students and how many test scores, okay, per student. So let's define that as arguments that they would have to pass into the constructor. So the first one is going to be an int, and that's going to be a regular variable. It's called number of students, okay? And the next one is going to also going to be an int. It's going to be how many test scores per student. So number of test scores per student. Okay, and once they provide us this, we can use these values to now initialize our 2-dimensional array. Okay, so this is just a class type variable that's going to hold a 2-dimensional array. Now let's go ahead and create the 2-dimensional arrays because we know how many rows or how many columns. So basically, how many students and how many test scores per student. And so now the student test score, which is that array, that 2-dimensional array, is going to be, now we are now creating that object. So it's going to be equal to a new, it's going to be a new double 2-dimensional array, right? But then now we know the number of students, okay, which is whatever the user Okay, I'm going to change this to number of students, which is whatever the user provided us. So I'm going to paste that here. And then number of test scores per student, I'm going to paste that here. So when someone creates an object from this class, it sets or it initializes this two-dimensional array to however many students and however many test scores, okay, per student. All right. And then that's it for now. So we're done with this gradebook class for now. We'll come back and modify it, but the program says we should go ahead and demonstrate the class in a program that allows the user to enter each student's name and his or her 4 test scores. So let's create another file, and then this is going to be the program that's going to test the class. So I'm going to call this, let's go ahead and create a class, public class. Let's call this gradebook test. Let's go ahead and create a main method, public static void main. Okay, so this is also going to use the ArrayList, right? Before we get there, when we get there, we'll import it just so it makes sense, just so you know why we are importing it. So I'll just leave it for now. For now, let's save it. I'm going to compile this, and I'm going to save this program here. This is the program that's going to test the class. I'm going to save this program in the same folder as the class itself. Now, when you do that, because you're saving the 2 files or the 2 programs in the same folder, it's going to, once you try to create, when you try to create an object from this class, this program knows that it has the path, it has access to the class directly because they're in the same folder, so they're not going to be errors. But if you don't save the class itself in the same location as the program, then you'd have to specify to the program where your class is. Otherwise, you're going to end up getting an error. So because I have 2 files, okay, the class and the program that tests the class in the same folder, there shouldn't be any errors when I'm trying to create an object from this gradebook.java class. Okay, so I'm going to save this as gradebook test .java in here. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to make a copy of this question here, so we can refer it from this file as well. Okay. So demonstrates the class in a program that allows the user to enter each student's name. Let's work on that. So since we're going to be allowing the user to type in basically inputs, we're going to be accepting inputs from the user. We can use either the JOptionPane class or we can use the scanner class. To do that, let's just use the scanner class for now. To use the scanner class, we have to go ahead and import it. So import java.util.scanner. We are importing the scanner class located in the java.util package located in the Java API. Right, so we have to create a scanner object so we can use that object to accept information from the user. So I'm going to create a scanner class type variable, and I'm going to call it keyboard. Okay, because we're going to be reading information from the keyboard. This is just a variable name that's going to hold a scanner object. Now let's go ahead and create the scanner object. I'm going to go ahead and create a new scanner object. I'm going to pass in the system.in method. The system.in method is going to accept, it's going to basically accept byte info from the keyboard. And then since we have it connected to the scanner, we can use the methods in the scanner class to convert whatever information we got from the user to whatever data type we want it to be, whether it's strings or doubles or ints and so on and so forth. So now that we have the scanner object, we can go ahead and ask the user to enter a name. Okay, the name of basically the names of the students. It says we should write a program that allows the user to enter each student's name and his or her 4 test scores. All right. Before that, we need to create an object from this gradebook class, right? Let's do that. But if we're doing that, then we need to know how many students and how many test scores per student. You can create the program in such a way that you ask the user to type in how many students and how many test scores. You can do that, but let's hard code it in here for now. Later on, you can modify it if you want. Rather, we would ask the user, okay, to type in your names and type in your test scores. That's what the program wants us to do. And so I'm going to create an object from this gradebook class. Okay, so it's going to be of type gradebook, and I'm going to call this, let's say, class of 2018. All right, so this right here is just like creating a variable. I'm going to use a comment to describe it. It's just like creating a variable int number. This is the data type. This is just a variable name. You can think of this as a type. You can think of this as a variable name. This is a class type variable because it's going, it's created from, it's going to use to represent an object from this class. All right, but Java will realize that this is not one of the primitive data types, and so it's going to look in that folder or the path that you've told this program where your class is, where the gradebook class is, and once it finds it, it's going to say, oh, okay, you're trying to create an object of type gradebook, and it's going to reserve this class of 2018 variable or whatever variable name you have. It's going to reserve that class type variable, okay, to hold a gradebook object. Okay, so let's go ahead and create that object. So this is just a variable that's going to hold a gradebook object. And so I'm going to use a new keyword. I'm going to create a new gradebook object. Now we define the constructor in such a way that this is a constructor. We define it in such a way that it accepts the number of students and the number of test scores per student. We need values for them. Now you can go ahead and directly type it in here, right? But just to make the program a bit more organized, right, I'm going to define them as final values, right? So I'm going to define a final value. I'm going to call this number of students. It's going to be an int. I'll call it number of students. Now this is what I was trying to do in the class itself. The reason why I scratched that was because we can directly use the values here. Okay, we can directly use the values that are passed into this constructor to initialize the two-dimensional array, instead of taking the values, storing them in the fields that we're about to create here, and then using those fields that we had up here to initialize the initialize the two-dimensional array. So it's kind of a long process, but it makes things clear. But we don't need it, and that's why we've kind of shortened it this way. So it's similar to what we are doing here. This is just for clarity. So final int number of student is going to represent the number of students, and let's set that to 5, right? Because that's what the program said. 5 arrays of 4 doubles each, 5 students with 4 scores each. And then let's do the same thing. Again, I'm using the uppercase convention with underscores to represent final values. You don't it's just a public convention. I'm going to create another one. It's going to be final int, but not number of students this time around, but number of test scores per student. And I'm going to set that to 4 for now. The beautiful thing about this program is that once we are done, we can just change these values, and it's going to represent either 8 students and 2 scores or whatever values we put there. But for now, we're going to stick with what the question says, and then we're going to, it's going to be 5 and 4. So the constructor needs the number of students, okay, and the number of test scores. Number of students, number of test scores. We have them in these final entities or final variables. It's not a variable, it's a constant. We have them here. And so we are passing a number of students, which we have here. And then it also needs the number of test scores per student, which we have stored here. So now we've created our object, passing in the right values. Our two-dimensional array, okay, for this particular class of 2018 object has been created, has been initialized. Let's compile this and see if we have any errors so far. No errors. That's good. We still need to ask the user to enter the name. Okay, since we know how many students and how many test scores per student, we need to ask the user to enter 5 names to represent each student, right? And then we add the names in the student names array list, and we add the scores in our basically our two-dimensional array. Okay. Again, our two-dimensional array will contain arrays, okay, and each array will contain scores of a particular student. So since we know how many students, how many test scores, we have our two-dimensional array initialized. Let's loop through it, okay? And while we are looping through it, we asked the names and the scores, because that's going to be automatic, and that's going to be, the efficient way. That's going to be the right way to do it. We're going to create for loops, 2 for loops, 1 for loop in an outer for loop, and that's the way to go through a 2-dimensional array. So I'll try to make this clear. So I'm going to create a first for loop. So for, okay, let's just create the structure for now. First is going to be in our 2-dimensional array. We're going to represent just the arrays, the individual arrays in the 2-dimensional array. The individual arrays represent scores of each student. So let's start with that. Okay, and so I'm going to create a target variable that's going to represent the index of each particular array, which is going to be of each particular list of scores or array of scores. So for int current student, this is going to be a current student, because if we are dealing with the first array is going to be the scores of the first student. Second array is going to be the scores of the second student, and so on and so forth. So for int current student is equal to 0, as long as the current student, okay, now we're dealing with an index here, okay, current student. We can actually use the word index, current student index, if you want. So for int current student index is equal to 0, as long as the current student index is less than the length of that array, right? It's less than the length of the array. So let's see. For int current students, okay. And so we know the one beautiful thing is that because we store the values here in these, okay, as finals, we have the number of students here already, because these are the same values that we use to create or to initialize the 2-dimensional arrays. So we can use this value to represent the length of that, of basically how many arrays are in this 2-dimensional array. Okay, and we can use the number 4 to represent how many slots are in each of the arrays in the 2-dimensional array. All right, so for int current student is equal to 0, as long as the current student is less than the number of students. Okay, then we want to do what's in the loop. And before we come back to check to see if the current student is less than the number of students, add 1 to current student index. Right? We are initializing current student index to 0, checking to make sure that that index is a valid index in that array, right? Because if it's a valid index, then the index is always going to be less than the length of the array. In this case, it's going to be 5. There are 5 arrays in that 2-dimensional array, or 5 students. If it's less than the length of the array, then that means it's a valid index. So we're going to use that index to fetch information from that array. Once we are done, we increase the current student index by 1, and then we check to make sure that the current student index is less than the number of students, or less than the length of the array. If that's the case, then that index is a valid index. That's a valid item in the array. We can use it to do whatever we want in this loop. So we're going through because it's a 2-dimensional array, we are going through the arrays, okay, in the 2-dimensional array. Remember, a 2-dimensional array is an array of arrays, and each array has slots or values in there. In our case, we have an array that contains 5 arrays, okay, 5 students, and each array contains 4 slots or 4 scores per student. So we're using this loop to go through, first of all, the arrays, and then we're going to use another loop to go through the scores in each array. So start with the first student, who has an index of 0. Start with that array, and then let's create another for loop that's going to go through. Make sure you go through all the student scores, that particular student score. That's why we named this current student. So go through the current student scores, and then move on to the next student, and then go through their scores, right? So that's why we are using a loop in a loop. And so since we're going to go through the scores of a particular current student, right, then let's call this, let's create another target variable that's going to be an int, and then call this current student score, right? Let's set that to also equal to 0. Let's check to make sure that that index, let's call this index current student index. So current student score index, okay? Let's make sure that the current student score index is less than, okay, number of test scores per student, which we've set to 4. And if we check to see if that score is a valid score in the array, okay, because if it's a valid score, then it's going to have an index less than the length of that particular array, right? Or the length of that particular row, which is that array. If that's the case, then it's a valid index or a valid value in the array. We work with it, and then once we are done, we increase current student score index by 1. We check to make sure that index is less than the number of test scores per student. We're basically going through all the elements in this test score, that particular student's test scores, and then we are using the values, making sure we are not exceeding that array. Okay, making sure each element we're accessing is really a valid value in that array. And so check to see if that particular score is a valid score, or basically has a valid index in the array, and increase the current student test score index. Increase the current student test score index by 1. I know it can get confusing, but I've done programs in the past where we used actually in this chapter 7. Look at the very early videos where we've used two loops to go through two-dimensional arrays. All right, so now this gives us a good structure to go through our array. It's a very good structure because we are going through, first of all, the individual arrays. We are accessing, first of all, the first array. We are going through all the scores. And then we go through to the next array. And then we go through all the scores. Now, this is a good way because we know that once we get to this first array, we are dealing with the first student, right? Before we get to their scores, before we get to the loop that accesses their scores, let's ask them, okay, let's ask the name of the first student. So I'm going to use a system.out.println, and I'm going to say, please enter the name of student 1, right? But how do we access 1? So we know that current student index is just used to represent the index of the particular student, okay, of the particular array in that two-dimensional array. But the index, okay, of the first student is 0. The index of the second student, okay, is 1. The index of the third student is 2. Now we can access this value here, but we can add 1 to it, so we can display the result in our system.out.println statement. So if we say, please enter the name of student, let's concatenate it to the value of current student index. For now, it will display as 0. 0 is just the index for student 1. Okay, student 2 has index 1. Student 3 has index 2. So if we just kind of add 1 to it, we are displaying, instead of 0, 1. And this is true because we are just adding 1 to the current student index. If it's the first student, he will have an index of 0. We don't want to display 0, we want to display 1. So let's just add 1 to it. If it's the second student, he or she will have an index of 1, right? But we want to display, please enter the name of student 2. So we add 1 to it, just so we can get that effect on the screen. I'm also going to surround this with parentheses, because if you don't, then you are going to concatenate the value of current student index to the string, and you're not going to get the right result. And so let's see. Let's just compile this to see if we first of all have any errors. We don't. I want to see if it works. When we run it, well because there's no way to stop it right now, but we can see it's starting to work, right? Just ignore the last 4 lines and see this. It says, please enter the name of student 1, right? There's no way to stop it yet, so it's okay. Let's just do that. So once we ask the user to type in the name of student 1, since we have the scanner object here, which is keyboard, we can use that. I'm going to call keyboard.next. We are accepting a string, so keyboard.next line. Okay, so keyboard.next line is going to pop up some kind of text box, and it's going to allow the user to type in a name. Now, whatever the user types is going to be returned as a string, and so we need a place to store it. So I'm going to come up here, and I'm going to define a string, and I'm going to call it student name. And so student name is going to store whatever the user typed, okay, as a string here, right? And then now we want to go through, this loop is going to go through the scores of that particular student. Okay, so let's have another message that says, please enter the name, please enter the scores, right? Please enter the scores of, let's just delete all this. Please enter the scores of, the scores of who? The good thing is we have the student name here. But one thing we forgot to do actually, we forgot to do something. We got the name here, right? Let's go ahead. We have to go ahead and add it to the array list, right? The array list here. Now, as it stands, or before we get to this loop here, as it stands, we have the name here, but we need to store it in that array list. But there's no way for us to add this name to the array list. We need to use a method in the class the object we just created. We need a method in this class, okay, to allow us to store the value, this name here in the array list. As it stands, there's no method here that allows us to add values to the array list. And so let's go ahead and create another instance method before the constructor. I like to keep my constructor as the last thing in the class. This is just a preference. You can keep it any way you want, as long as it's in the class. So I'm going to go ahead and create another setter or a mutator. This method here is going to set values, okay? So it's also an instance method, so no keyword static. So public, no keyword static. Is it going to have a return type? No, it's only going to set a value. So the return type is going to be void, which means nothing. I'm going to call it set student name. And then set student name, okay, think about it, it's going to need an argument. If you're setting a student name, you need the name so you can set it, right? So what is the name? So the name, whoever calls this method needs to provide in a string, right? So I'm going to define a string here, and I'm going to call it student name. You need to provide a student's name. And then we have to add the student name to the array list. Now the array list has a method called add, and add will take a value and store it in an array list. And so our array list, that was a bit of a tongue twisting there. Our array list, okay, which is called student names, okay, I copied it. I'm going to call the method add.add, and add will take in a value and store the value in that array list. And so the value here is whatever the user passes in here as an argument, which is student name. And so student names.add the student name that was given. So now we have a way to add values to the array list. In our main method, once we have the student name here, before we go ahead and go through the scores of that particular student, let's add that value to our object, right? We've created our object class of 2018. And so we have a method for that class of 2018 dot, we called it set student name, right? We can't just use .add here because first of all, it doesn't even have the array list here, but we have an object created from this class. So it's created from this class. So we have now a method here we can use to add values to the array list. So class of 2018 dot set student name, right? We are accessing the methods here with a dot operator. So dot set student name, and what value? Okay, what name are you setting? We have the student name here, so we provided it here because it needs a student name, and so we provided it the student name. So it's going to go ahead and go to the object and set and add this name to the array list basically. All right, so that's good. We missed that step. That was very important. Otherwise, when we're trying to read from the array list, it will be empty. All right, so we have the student's name and we have it stored, okay, in the object, okay, or in our array list. We're going to go through the particular student's scores before we move on to the next student, right? So now we're going to say, please enter the score of. Now, because you have it stored in an object, you can access it because we created a method called get student name, and that's why the question said we should create a method. Okay, the class should have a method that returns a specific student name. We called it get student name. You can use that. Or we also have it stored here in our main method. We also have it stored in this variable, so we can just use it to display information. We can say, please enter the score of student name. I'm going to concatenate it with a variable student name. Makes the program a bit more flexible, right? And then we display this to the user, and we allow the user to type in a value. And so we say, we're going to use the scanner object, which is keyboard. I'm going to call keyboard dot. If you are telling them to enter a score, okay, they're going to enter a double because the score can be 66.5. So keyboard dot next double. Okay, this is going to pop up some kind of text box, and it's going to allow the user to type in a value. Now, whatever the user types is going to be converted to a double and then sent back. It's going to be sent back as a double. And so if it's sending back that whatever the user's type, which is a score, we need a place to store it. So I'm going to come up here and define a double. I'm going to call it student score, and I'm going to store student score here. Oh, sorry. Yeah, student score is going to store whatever the user type, okay, as a double. The same way we store the name in the object, we also need to store the score in the right slot, okay? And so we have our object here, and we have a way. We need to have a way to store values in our two-dimensional array, okay? We don't have the method here yet. So the same way we need to create a method that is going to allow us to add values to the two-dimensional array, okay? So if you think about it, what are we adding? We're adding a score here of a particular student, right? So let's first of all create the method. It's going to be a public method again. No keyword static because it's going to be an instance method. Now, this is not going to return anything. It's just going to set a value. So it's also going to have a return type as void. We're going to call it set student. Let's see if I'm doing the right thing here. So we need to store the scores. So yeah, we'll call it set student score, okay? Because we are setting a particular score at a time. And then let's construct this method. So if you're setting the student score and we are dealing with the two-dimensional array here, you need the particular slot, okay? So we need to tell them which array are you accessing, okay? Which index of the array are you accessing, and which slot in the array you want to store the score. So it's going to need, okay, the particular student we are dealing with, the index of the particular student. So index, I'm going to set or define a parameter for the student index you want to store the score for. And then in what slot, okay, do you want to store that particular score, okay? So that's also going to be the index of the score. So score index or score position. You can name it that way. And then once you determine the position, you need a score itself. So that score is going to be a double, and we need the student score, right? And once we have the information, we can now access our two-dimensional array, which is student test, the student test scores. And then we have the values. We need to specify where in the array. We have the student index here, and we have the score index. That's the location of where this value is going to be set to. We set it equal to the particular student score. That is going to be provided to us when someone calls the set student score method. It returns nothing, so we don't need a return statement. Now let's go back to our main method. So we have the student score here. That means we need to set that score. Okay. The good thing about this loop in a loop is it keeps track of which particular student we have. So currently we are on if we start the loops, if the loop iterates for the very first time, all of us, we are starting with the first student, and this will also keep track of the particular current score. It keeps track of everything. The current student index will keep track of the current student, and the current student score index will keep track of the current score of that particular student, right? So the good thing is now we can use those values to store the score. We have a method called setStudentScore. I'm going to use it, but it's in the class, so we have to attach it to the object, right? So we're going to call class of 2018 dot setStudentScore. Now, in this method, it needed the student index, which is going to be our current student index, right? Because we're dealing with the current student. It also needs our score index. Which particular score are we on right now? So current student score index will keep track of that. We are going to score. We're going to the word score and store are similar, so it's kind of confusing to mention them. We are going to store the particular. We're going to store the particular student score, okay, and current student score index will keep track of that particular student score, okay, and also current student index will keep track of the particular student. So it needs the current student index, okay, which is the student index. It needs the score index, which is going to be kept track by our current student score index here. And then it needs the score, which we have here, right? It needs the score itself, which we'll have here as the student score. So I'll paste that also here. Okay, so once we do that, this is a way now to store values in a two-dimensional array. So let's just try it. Now we're not going to see anything because we are not printing out the details of the two-dimensional array, but let's just test it to see if it works. Run. It says, please enter the name of student 1. I'm going to enter K. Now it says, please enter the score of K. Now that's a beautiful way of working, because now the two-dimensional array is just running through the loop is just running through the two-dimensional array, making sense for us, right? Sorry, I know I talk a bit fast. I get very excited when I'm working on projects like these, so that's why I talk very fast. But bear with me and just work with me, okay? If you have any questions, always feel free to comment down below. All right, so let's just test this. We're going to get a problem with a scanner object. There is this common problem about it, but we'll fix it. So please enter the score of K1. Now we have to display this to tell us which particular score, the first, second, third, or fourth, right? Again, we have the current index, the score index, the current score index stored in this variable, so we can use it in our statement. We can say, please enter score 1 of K, or for K. So remember, we know that the same way we did this, we know 0, okay, represents the first score, okay, of the student. 1 represents the second score. 3 represents the 2 represents the third score, and so on and so forth. So please enter let's just concatenate it here, and I'm going to concatenate it here with the value. So please enter the current score index, but then we have to add 1 to it just so it makes sense. So plus 1, I'm going to surround it with parentheses here. So please enter the current score index plus 1 score, okay, I'm going to concatenate it here, of the student name, right? So if we're dealing with the first score, it's going to have an index of 0. If we're dealing with the second score, it's going to have an index of 1, and so on and so forth. That's why we are adding 1 to it, just so it makes sense. If you're dealing with 0, that's the first score, so add 1 to it just so it says, please enter score 1, okay, of now better. Okay, so please enter score 1 of student name. Oops. Let's see here. I messed it up. Please enter score 1 of, let's concatenate it with what's stored in student name. Now it makes sense. All right. So I'm sure some of you caught it. So this is what's going to, it worked before, so that means I just messed up the string.